Welcome to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. I'm your host, Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with our diplomatic correspondent, Lazar Berman, and a special guest, John Spencer. Hello, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hello, Amanda. Good to be here.
Hi, Amanda.
So glad to have you back. John is the chair of war studies at the Madison Policy Forum and executive director of the Urban Warfare Institute. He's also what I like to call the tunnel guy. And so for the first part of our conversation, we're going to plumb the depths of the Hamas tunnels in Gaza. And in the second half, we're going to turn to John's thoughts on the ceasefire and whether it can reach a new phase, and what he thinks about the idea of an international security force with a 2-year mandate to basically make order in the Gaza Strip. So all of this and more after the break.
I always say, if there's one thing we need to do really well, it's delight the customer. Our goal is for everything we do to quietly fade into the background so the customer simply thinks, wow, that was really easy. What's made this journey so meaningful is the ongoing challenge of delivering personal connection and thoughtful, tailored service in a virtual world. And especially now, that connection feels more important than ever. We're one nation, one family. When we heard about Hayalim getting engaged and planning quick weddings, we knew we wanted to help, so we gifted them beautiful ketubas, a small but heartfelt thank you for their courage, their protection, and all they're doing for Am Yisrael. We hear it all the time. People are saying, this is the best company I've ever worked with. And honestly, that comes down to one thing: the care each team member puts into every single order.
I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with our diplomatic correspondent, Lazar Berman, and our special guest, John Spencer. So, John, as of recording time, there are about 100 to 200 Hamas terrorists estimated to be holed up in tunnels in southern Gaza in the side that Israel controls in the Gaza Strip, in the Israeli side of the yellow line, as we call it. And as you know, the U.S. has pressured Israel to allow these Hamas terrorists safe passage back into Gaza. Israel has so far not agreed to do that. And these 100 or 200, they're trapped in various different tunnels throughout the Gaza Strip in the southern half, at least. So, John, I just want to start with, based on your knowledge of this extensive, really extensive tunnel network in Gaza, how much of Hamas is actually still underground right now during the ceasefire?
I mean, it would be really hard to give that estimate. I mean, I was about a month ago in Gaza City outside the Al-Shati camp, and they still had Hamas popping out of tunnels. How many are stuck down there? How many of them are living down there? It would be really hard to give an estimate. I mean, it's in the thousands, I would say for sure. Of course, the news of this 100 to 200 group in the southern portion, but I still think people, and it's really hard. There's actually something in education called innumeracy, where it's hard to imagine the number just because it's almost like fictional because you just say a number. In my last trip, I actually sat down with the IDF to discuss the tunnels, which information about the tunnels has changed from beginning, before October 7th, even during, as the discovery of the tunnels has happened, where originally it was, 500 kilometers. The new estimate is 1,000 kilometers. So even if you have the yellow line, which most people know, and that 53% that's technically IDF controlled, you still have hundreds of miles of tunnels. And even when you say that, it's really hard for people to think about that. It's called the Gaza Metro, but I even that doesn't work because there's no metro in the world that is 600 miles. So, and it's layers, and it's so hard when you're walking the ground to know that underneath you, there's a world, and there's only a few ways to really know if there's a tunnel underneath you. So even these 100 to 200, it's not like you know exactly where they're at. They're in, you point over there, you're like they're over there in that region, and but the depth of knowledge, and I know that when the U.S. Vice President visited recently, Defense Minister Kotz talked to him about, like, this is a very big problem, and I don't think people understand the scale of the problem.
Let's talk about it a little bit more. I mean, for myself, when I'm trying to conceptualize what's happening underground, I think of an ant farm. You know, you have this glass slice and you can just see these tunnels throughout the whole depth of it. And that to me, it really helped me kind of figure out what's going on under Gaza, because I just want to remind our listeners that basically Hamas is using the entirety of above ground as its human shield, meaning all the Hamas terrorists were holed up and maybe still are holed up underground, using all the above ground as this cushiony layer.
Absolutely. And even the ant farm, because it changes so much. This is 20 years. So you have ants for 20 years doing this. Some centralized knowledge, Mohammed Sinwar was kind of the tunnel guy for Hamas for a while, but these tunnels were dug actually more than 20 years. I was presenting on the tunnel bombs that terrorists would dig underneath the IDF during the basically before disengagement, and blow them up underneath. So some of these tunnels are actually old tunnels that weren't used and new tunnels. I don't know how I would physically render it to give people an idea of the Swiss cheese underneath, let alone the cross border. I actually found out, which actually will bleed into, I'm sure, our discussion with Lazar about how difficult it is to control security in general. And with the tunnels that were going between Egypt and Gaza, despite all efforts, even by Egypt in 2017 to fill them with sewer water and collapse what they thought were many, there were still like 100 found. And the only way the IDF could say now with real strong accuracy that there is no longer tunnels going from Gaza to Egypt was to do statistical drilling. So they drilled a hole in the ground every 8 feet for the entire 10 mile of the Philadelphia corridor. And now they can say, we found them, we've remediated or destroyed them, and there's a couple ways to do that, and that will really play into factors of demilitarization and everything else. You had to start with what tunnels mattered most, and that's really why we've gotten to this point where people, what do you mean they haven't even destroyed even 20% of the tunnels in 2 years of work? One is people are failing to actually acknowledge the depth of the Swiss cheese underneath Gaza. Also, then what does it take to make a tunnel safe, to destroy it, and all these different means that you deal with the tunnels, like the IDF. And I just saw this week, we get these videos of where a hostage was held, they're destroying that tunnel with explosives. And we get like these little videos, but it's really the IDF for over 2 years, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, have been working to destroy the tunnels, let alone map the tunnels and know where they're at. It's a massive engineering project for sure.
Right. And of course, until recently, there were living hostages that Israel had to be on alert for. And so I just wonder, John, if you think that there will be any kind of change in terms of how Israel will explode or neutralize the tunnels now that there's no actual fear for Israeli citizens or other citizens.
It definitely changes some aspects. The tunnels that were basically being left untouched because of concern for hostages in those areas. Although, I mean, even though that there's an estimate of 1,000 kilometers of tunnels, there's still unknown areas where there is limits to, like the 15%, the central camps and others, where there's some intelligence and there's all kinds of ways to do it. It doesn't change actually how you destroy a tunnel. Definitely where you operate against Hamas in tunnels, it definitely gives you freedom of ability, even though there are limits to bunker buses, because these tunnels go just underneath all the buildings to over 200 feet underground. So there is some limits of even being able to use standoff weapons and the risk to soldiers when you find a tunnel. And that's why, this case where these Hamas fighters are trapped in the tunnels and different variations of, you should let them go, but they have to disarm. Well, they don't want to disarm on the way out. All these variations. Yes, there are some things that open up, but really the challenge of destroying this network of tunnels, because I firmly believe, again, it gets into like the day after conversations, you can't leave this tunnel network for anybody because it really prevents stabilizing any area. And there's some historical examples in other parts of the world that you can't leave this infrastructure behind, not even for Hamas, but for anybody.
Yeah, but as you said, it's all under all sorts of different buildings. And you said very much in passing that the Mawasi camp, the humanitarian, or the section that was considered the part where all the civilians should go, that is used because there are no tunnels under, because it's on the seashore, correct? And so the whole rest of Gaza essentially could be one big, catacomb of tunnels. And if the tunnels are destroyed or neutralized, could that not just even more destroy the upper Gaza, the built Gaza?
So that's a great question. And I think Lazar, having been into Gaza so many times, will understand that, there is areas in Gaza that have not been destroyed. But in places like where we're talking about Rafah, the actual rubble creates even another problem of, even if you know where a tunnel is, you want to deal with it. But now there's an 8-story building that was destroyed in combat in part of the operations against Hamas. And now you have the rubble aspect. You have a mined rubble aspect. And while the UN, I don't trust most of their estimates, but you're talking, they estimate 30 years to demine the rubbleized portions of Gaza. Well, now you have a tunnel underneath all of that, which the tunnel is mined as well. I don't want to be the negative Nancy. It's just a massive project where you do get to, lots of people can contribute to deminers, construction equipment to dig things out. Absolutely that. But your question is about, okay, if you destroy a tunnel, and I've asked this as well, there's 2 explosive methodologies that the IDF use, either a liquid explosive that's poured into it, which is no risk to IDF soldiers, or the, stringing the tunnel with mines and things like that, which is actually risk, and you have to clear the tunnel so that you can actually put mines into it to destroy it. Usually Hamas, like you said, as closer you get to the sea, the higher the water table is and the less chances, and that's why Al-Mawasi beach zone, there are no tunnels because the water table is right there. But in the other areas, Hamas, again, 20 years of this, will dig down to the clay and then start to dig their tunnels. So actually from surface disruption, you can actually see tunnels being destroyed with explosives and there's no impact to the surface, because the what you had to geology wise to create these voids is take it down to a level, but digging it out from the surface may be an option as well. But that concern of, you just can't leave it there, and when you use explosives, most of the surface is already rubbleized. So I think it mitigates itself out on that point.
I'm going to ask you one more question before I hand over to Lazar, and that's about what kind of Israeli innovations have you been tracking during this 2-year war? I'm sure Israel itself has, we're the startup nation. I'm sure we've adapted and adopted along the way. So what are you seeing on that front?
Oh, that would be a separate series of podcasts. I'm
up for it.
Yeah, like 20 tactical lessons. Some of the highlights, of course, is the underground aspects, which is an interesting story. And I'm surprised you didn't ask me, because even from Israelis, I get the question of, why can't you just flood the tunnels? And Israel tried that in the beginning, innovatively, called it Project Atlantis, brought in 5 industrial pumps, started pumping seawater and fresh water, even though, the world said you're salting the earth, which is ridiculous, not true. But the water, it didn't work. It just failed because it seeps out through the walls. Many of these have drainage in them. Innovations though, from full-scale close combat in dense urban terrain that I follow, the advancements in facial recognition capabilities. So being able to put facial recognition on drones, being able to do combat operations in areas densely populated of people. And we've talked about in the past, why are the people still there? Why aren't they moved to Egypt? But the ability to do encirclements of areas and use facial recognition to pick out the Hamas members coming out of the hospital or in the crowd, that's an innovation and there's an artificial intelligence layer on top of that, because you can have all the video in the world and facial recognition key, but if there isn't an artificial intelligence algorithm that's picking it out, then these are the innovations that Israel has been doing in real time that nobody in the world has ever done. Baghdad 2009, I have a little book of faces and I'm flipping through the faces and looking at people trying to figure out who they are. In the underground world, of course, all the technologies you need to include, wet cement is really from even, Operation Northern Shield and the tunnels, Hezbollah tunnels, and filling a tunnel with wet cement is a very Israeli invented solid way to do it, but it's cost prohibitive, where it's like $1 million, if not $2 million per kilometer to fill a void full of wet cement. So again, Israel innovations and the fact that the reserve force is made up of all these scientists and all of these things started to mess with the properties of cement, where they could make it cost less but be harder than the dirt, or using old mining robots inside of the tunnels to destroy them. So many innovations to the blood, what Israel did to save soldiers' lives on the battlefield. There's just such a long list, Amanda, that I don't know which one to pick from. And also, which I think is important to say, the innovations that Israel has done to limit civilian harm are also massive innovations that will save lives on any future battlefield. Israel's civilian harm mitigation cell, the use of a technology to track, cell phones, aerial footage and everything, to overlay it in real time, to be able to tell you how many people are in an area at all, any people. And then that has never been done before. It's just, usually you do notifications, you give time, and then you enter the area and you use, all of the rules of engagement. But Israel has developed technologies to be able to tell you, like, no, in that area, there is still a lot of civilians left, and that will impact the future. Even though they don't get credit, innovations that Israel has created to identify civilians left in an area is significant.
John, I feel like you've just given us this buffet of appetizers of different things that we should explore in future conversations. But in the meantime, we're going to go to a short break.
On October 7, I was here at the Nova Music Festival. I ran for my life, hid for 7 hours. Terrorists shot me twice. Thankfully, I survived. I'm still dealing with trauma, and I'm not alone. 3 million Israelis are in trauma. They need mental health care or physical rehabilitation. Wounded soldiers, families, and scared children.
Since 1912, Hadassah has been a life-changing force in Israel. Today, Hadassah has 2 world-renowned hospitals, pioneers breakthrough medical research, cares for youth, and has built the much-needed and largest rehabilitation facility in Jerusalem.
Thank you to everyone at Hadassah Hospitals. You've been helping me, and so many others. And a special thanks to one nurse, my mom. I love you.
And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with Lazar Berman, our diplomatic correspondent, and John Spencer. So, John, we're hearing that there's a draft United Nations proposal to create this international security force that would give some kind of 2-year mandate from, I believe, January 2026, basically to put Gaza in order. And Lazar and I have spoken many times about a similar but different situation in Lebanon, and that's with UNIFIL. And everything I've heard from Lazar indicates that it has been a weak and not good project. So, John, first of all, before I hand the mic over to Lazar, can you just describe what you know so far about this international security force?
So what I know so far is that, one, it's a sub-segment, like a working group of the overall 20-point peace plan, which I have been a huge fan of it because it's conditions-based. It shows lessons of past failures so I think even though I haven't seen the full draft, I've seen multiple reports of it going through, as it's been presented to the UN Security Council, many variations and nuances, but some of the key things that in the leaked draft were like all means necessary to control the situation. So that's where I'm hardened, and the World Bank, I think, as of this morning, kind of approved the plan because it does have a reconstruction, although The public statements have been no reconstruction in any area that Hamas control or hasn't been demilitarized. These are all conditions-based variables that were never in the UNIFIL mandate. And as you said, I wrote an article just comparing, although there are successes and failures in stabilization forces, and it really matters on what you call them, peacekeeping, peace monitoring, stabilization forces, right? If you can go on the line and look at the UNIFIL mandate, how light it is and how toothless it is, and the things that aren't in those, and then you go, as I have given an example of Kosovo, and look at the Kosovo mandate of what it actually says the functions are to create security, to do disarmament, to do demining, which actually gives you the authorities that any country whose force will be a part of either boots on the ground, which is a nuance, stabilization force versus of the 40 nations currently being involved in the project, which ones will actually be implementing this mandate, which is great to have a mandate. And I have, from what I've seen, the mandate includes all the language you'd want to see, which is very prescriptive functions that the force will be authorized to do, which will be resource. UNIFIL was basically a glorified monitor of a region, and then abysmal failure with no actual reoccurring checks to see if it was fulfilling its mandate, which is why we've gotten, decades of UNIFIL inaction. So that's why my article on that is called, Think Kosovo, Not Lebanon. Although there are other examples. You have the mandate of the Kosovo mission. You have the mandate of East Timor. So these are examples of what are the key principles that the mandate, which I think will be, it's in debate right now. From what I'm hearing, they shared the full version, I think last Friday, and they have multiple meetings trying to get it. But the latest I saw was the World Bank saying, no, we're actually okay with this. I mean, there's an estimate of $70 billion to reconstruct Gaza, but I'm sure we're going to talk about it with Lazar about you could do this in very small increments to include why this is only a 2-year mandate, which I actually like. 2 years, let's start implementing it. You have the peace board's involvement, and now you have ownership of the Security Council, and that really matters. While the UN says a lot, votes a lot, and really the Security Council is the one with teeth and authority and actually can do good.
Lazar, I'm handing you the mic, so please speak up. I have a gazillion million more questions, but I'm sure you have smarter ones. So Lazar, off to you.
Sure. Thank you, Amanda. So let's talk about what comes next in Gaza. And let's just remind our listeners where we are now. October 10th, everyone agrees that this ceasefire begins. There's supposed to be 72 hours of hostage release. Of course, all the living hostages are released. Israel releases all the Palestinian prisoners it's supposed to, but it doesn't get back immediately the dead hostages. Over the course of the past weeks, there has been this slow release, and we're left with 4 bodies still in the Gaza Strip. This was supposed to be the easy part, the first phase. We've seen how difficult it is, and we haven't even really started nailing down the second phase. So let's talk about some of the difficulties coming that we can anticipate in the second phase. And I would split them into 3, and you've touched on something: the disarming, the peacekeeping force, and the rebuilding or the rehabilitation. So let's talk about disarming first. How on earth do you disarm a force like Hamas? How would that even happen? Obviously, they want to seem like they're doing it, but obviously they're going to try to hide wherever they can. And there's endless weapons in the Gaza Strip, and they seem to be very good at resupplying. So is that even possible, and how would you go about doing that?
Sure. So it's absolutely possible. And I wrote another article highlighting, and Lazar, you and I have talked about why hasn't the IDF implemented clear, hold, and build. I interviewed General Gallant. He had the idea, called it bubbles a long time ago, of taking certain areas in Gaza that are less infiltrated, less embedded with Hamas than other areas, which are, there are different areas of varying difficulty, to include areas that beyond the yellow line, which gives people a visualization, beyond the yellow line that have never been contested, Hamas's actual power over the population in the central camps in parts of Gaza City. You do it bit by bit. In this article, I explained all the historical recent examples, let alone of taking, not nation building, but taking just pieces of ground, clearing it of everything, and then rebuilding something on top of it, the clear hold build model. One of the reasons why, and the nuances of the context of why the IDF wouldn't do this was because there had to be a force to hold the ground and never leave it. Now you have an idea of a stabilization force, potentially with a mandate to hold ground. I personally, and which will be really the nuances of what the mandate says, I don't think there's going to be any force but Israel that engages in high intensity combat against Hamas fighters, to include the ones as of this morning that were still trying to infiltrate beyond the yellow line to do attacks against the IDF, who are somewhat in different stationary positions. You do the disarmament, which I do agree is the highest priority, bit by bit. So now you have this 53% of Gaza with the yellow line that is IDF freedom of maneuver to operate with no political really opposition internationally. You have 40 nations. Everybody acknowledges, well, this side, there's not supposed to be any Hamas anyways. So you can actually take ground. This is why the points. So I don't do the phases, although people have done that with this 20-point plan. I just look at individual points, like point 17, which says, doesn't matter what Hamas does, we're going to move forward with this. If we have to do it zone by zone and hand it off, as in one of the examples, there was a country who helped expand, I won't say which country, the humanitarian zone between Gideon's Chariot A and B. They went into central Gaza. They basically used bulldozers, created a parking lot, and then put a fence around it and called it their country's humanitarian zone, and then put new tents inside of it when they expanded for the dislocation that was necessary in northern Gaza. I think that was like a little highlight in Gaza of what is actually possible. So you take portions that are completely, basically, there is no fighting happening. You take that piece of ground and you start building what we call a bubble of stable, a bubble, we call it Disneyland, clear it, make the tunnels gone, demine it, and actually start building a small community. And there are a few, tribal clans, all this, who say that, we are ready for that Hamas-free zone, which is actually point 1 of the peace plan. I absolutely think it's possible, but you're right, demilitarization is required before rebuilding. So again, $70 billion to rebuild Gaza, that's massive, almost turns people off of how do you do this with Hamas still fighting? Lots of examples of taking enemy-held territory, putting a circle around it, clearing everything out of it, not letting anybody back in until they've been screened, as in that's not Hamas, or they've signed a piece of paper saying, I was a Hamas, Gaza health ministry worker, but I'm not that anymore. And you build small little communities. This isn't nation building, which I really think people use on my end to kind of discredit the work that has to be done. And there are plenty of other models that show that it's absolutely possible. And that's what I see happening with the stabilization force mandate, is to get that right so you can start doing it while Hamas is trying to resupply. Although the drones and the Gaza, Egypt kind of military zone to stop the drone resupply, they're not going to have the type of, giant pipelines of trucks bringing them rockets and everything else. Yes, getting every AK-47 will be hard to do, but there's a hierarchy of that.
Aren't we risking, let's say we start doing that in the Israeli-controlled territory, aren't we risking demilitarizing territory, but you're still going to leave 47% of the strip and the organization itself still armed unless you push into that area, and that might mean reconquering each area before you rebuild and pacify it.
I don't think that's a risk. I think that's the plan. It's called the ink blot strategy. You start with a blot and it spreads out. So you start with the easier projects to show. This is why I don't mean to trivialize what I call the Disneyland plan, but as you take a small little area and you show people beyond the line, and I don't like the East-West Berlin thing I've heard about examples of having this, like it's a constant state that we're going to have this, Hamas free zone that you rebuild and you have the Hamas controlled areas. I don't think that's a good example to show people. But you're absolutely right. That's likely the plan, not because of what people want to happen, but what Hamas will try is to hold areas as long as they can with the stockpiles of weapons they have. And this is, again, why I think personally that eventually Israel and the IDF will have to close with and destroy irreconcilable portions of Hamas that are trying to survive on that side. But I've never seen anything writing that says you have the yellow line and that's the 20-point plan. We're going to move forward with that. No, step one of the 20-point plan is that Gaza will become a terror-free, demilitarized zone. But it's how you do it and actually starting the process now, which is what they're trying to do. And you spread that ink blot out where you do start crossing the yellow line. Maybe that's why there's certain timelines on the mandates or the projects. But you show people that it can be done. You can create these little zones that have been demilitarized, and then you start the de-radicalization, which is vital. And you start creating pockets of communities that are actually on a path forward that you show everybody who's not in that community, as in the Gazans, you show Israel is possible, and you really show the international partners it's possible. And this isn't the 2 million people. I fall in a neighborhood of Baghdad of 2 million. I mean, it isn't the scale that's the problem, but it is that everybody can see the plan happening, that there is a plan to disarm those that are refusing to disarm. And there's, in DDRs, what they call it, you can buy the weapons back. You can send people in like Israel to take it by force. There's a hierarchy of how to do that in those different zones. I don't think it's a risk, Lazar. I think that's the plan.
So you seem pretty positive about the potential for this international stabilization force. If I look at Israel's history, all these peacekeeping forces, whether it's in the Sinai, whether it's in Lebanon, they've only been effective when there was only peace, right? So when Nasser wanted to go to war with Israel in 1967, he kicked out the peacekeepers. And of course, we know what happened with UNIFIL. Why should it be different? Why do we think that any country would actually risk their soldiers' lives to fight for Israel? And wouldn't they just be getting in the way and restricting Israel's freedom of action?
It's a great question. I know it's a high on the concern. I do comparative analysis. So I do try to take examples to include in that region of failed, again, peacekeeping, peace monitoring versus stabilization forces, and why these tasks that they will be assigned are vital. I agree with you. That's one of the greatest risks to the stabilization force and the peace plan at all, is some country having a force in Gaza and they start to lose soldiers because it's their domestic population will be like, why is that happening? And why I think even in the 20 points, it talks about handing over areas to the stabilization force. That Israel IDF forces have brought the level of violence and militarization in that zone down to a level where stabilization forces partnering with more policing than they are warfare, which is really what, when you talk about stability forces, although there is in Kosovo even, there was a mandate for actually helping to create security and public order. So there's actually an enforcement mechanism. But that's the difference here for why would it work? One is that it's not just Israel and Egypt, Israel and Lebanon. And while UN's in there, and I think that's why the peace board is something different than the past models too, is you have 40 nations who want to put their name on it and say they're doing something. And then you have a few select individuals that are actually making the bigger decisions to include the continuity of the project. The UN security mandate is vital, but United States, UAE, a bunch of these countries are pretty vital, as in they're the part of the glue on this isn't just Israel, and why I'm positive about because before, like, why isn't Israel clear holding areas and basically creating good in Gaza is because there are strategic, even domestic reasons why that's not possible. Now it's not just Israel and Hamas, which was ridiculous if that's the conversation. Now it's this 40-nation stabilization force and against those trying to stop it from creating peace. And that's why I don't even like to use the word ceasefire. This is a peace plan to create stable zones in Gaza that actually would be possible because you have a control of the environment. Where if you're talking about the other parts about Judea and Samaria, about reforms with the Palestinian Authority, all that, it gets a lot more complex than what I think is possible at the ground level in Gaza is to create these stable areas, call them safe zones, call them stable zones is really important. So that's why I'm positive is that, yes, it looks like the people on that constructed this have learned about the lessons, do understand the risk. But when you start to get the people going, like, I don't want this country in there doing anything. And you're right, just like we've seen in even the Iraq and Afghanistan, a country may say they're helping and then put extreme limitations on their help based on their domestic concerns. That's going back to my first principle. I don't think anybody's going to be fighting high intensity warfare against Hamas other than Israel. And they're the best trained, best prepared to be able to do that. But they're not the ones who could have done the holding of areas and creating actual new communities of all the essential services and all the reforms that have to happen, the de-radicalization, the curriculum, all of these elements of the plan.
And just my final question. I mean, you seem to think that this doesn't head toward nation building. That's what I'm hearing from you. There was that political article earlier this week that, the slides that were presented seemed to talk about a long-term U.S. investment that's much bigger than what was publicly talked about. We're talking about re-education. We're talking about economic investments. Doesn't this all add up to what didn't work? At least maybe it worked in many ways, but it's not what the U.S. public wants to do again. And you're doing it with a population that is probably less open to, a lot of those Western ideas than maybe Iraq would have been.
It is a great debate to be had on one, yes, Western United States, especially horrible history of nation building in countries and trying to force a system that isn't that system in that country. Although we could debate whether Iraq was handed off in a better state versus the sectarian policies that basically caused everything to fall apart. The reason that I don't think, again, this isn't Israel's or this isn't the United States' peace plan. This is all those nations that have signed their name to it, who will all take vital parts that the United States can't come in and build the curriculum in that cultural understanding, which is always the problem with nation building, is you're trying to force on them your way, not their way. One of the reasons why I don't think this is nation building, because again, the Palestinian state ideal versus a very controlled environment in Gaza and creating stable zones, which do set you up for one governance, but I actually don't think you'll see one governance in Gaza anytime soon. You'll see these stable zones with governance, local governance, which is also historical, while other people take on this massive challenge of Palestinian Authority reform and all of the future of that. That's part of that nation building. Like, nobody's building a nation in Gaza. They're building bubbles of stable zones. And yes, Israel's worked to create the corridors, whereas a part of that, right? Because as you know, Lazar, more than I do, that the areas of Rafah are a lot different than even the cultural makeup of Gaza City, certain camps and areas there, different tribes, different clans, different radicalization, different openness to change. And that's why this isn't the United States and Israel nation building. This is why I think the Arab countries, especially Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Egypt, are vital to, once you create these communities, then who's in charge of the governance, the policing. But I also want to, if we don't have any time, is that none of this happens quickly. The Kosovo mission is still in Kosovo. We're still in Japan. We're still in Germany. We're still in South Korea. The ideal that there's a quick fix, we can do this in 2 years, we can do this in 10 years, and then it's good, I think is not also historical either. We're still partnering with Kosovo policing forces. That partnership, leadership, mentorship of even security forces that will be created are all vital into creating lasting stability and peace, which do set you up for a much broader conversation later But that's not nation building today. And that's why I'm adamant that be careful on the comparative analysis of nation building versus what we're talking about here, very localized reform of terrain and then establishing new communities, which even de-radicalization takes years. But you have to start in order to get the clock ticking.
Well, it sounds like we're going to have many future opportunities to talk about how well this plan is moving forward, because it does seem like we're going to be there for a long time. So plenty to talk about. But Amanda, that's all I have for this conversation.
I have about 500 more hours of questions for John, but poor John, I'm going to let you go. So I hope you will join us again in a future Friday Focus episode.
Thank you so much. Thank you both. I listen every day.
Thank you. That's what I like to hear. So thank you all for listening to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. Please check out another installment next week. This podcast was produced by The Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next time, shalom.